Hola, greetings from Mexico City, as we would say in Spanish. Hola, buenos dias, or good morning. I'm Sam Santiago. My pronouns are he, him, his, and in Spanish, él. I've been a certified diversity executive since 2015, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. A little bit about me. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, born, raised, and educated on the island. And after a brief stint in Edmonton, Canada, in my early 20s, I landed in Dallas, Texas, where I would live, love, work, worship, and play for the next 25 years. After a close encounter with the great beyond, or as we call it in Buddhism, which I have been practicing for the last 21 years, samsara, due to COVID in 2020, I got pretty sick. In 2021, I somehow rebounded, fell in love, got married, and moved to Mexico, which is where I'm coming from today to all of you. My husband Enrique and I have lived in the maritime port of Manzanillo on the Pacific coast, in Veracruz on the Gulf Coast. And although we're fortunate to have these beautiful homes in both cities, we really only call Mexico City home, where we share a roof with three very spoiled Pomeranians in what has been known as Frida Kahlo's neighborhood in Mexico City. The neighborhood is called Coyoacán. So whenever you're ready, and I mean it, mi casa es su casa, my home is your home. That's what we say in Spanish. So hopefully at some point we'll connect and you'll come down to Mexico City and visit just south of the border. Another important part of the conversation today is putting the conversation within context. And why would a cisgender male present on a topic centered on women, you might ask? Well, because I'm also Hispanic, and I'm very proud of my Latino roots. Obviously, I feel it is important that we talk about topics that have to do with the Hispanic community and the larger Latin American community beyond the borders of the US, in ways that maybe we don't get to talk about very often, right? Many times we talk about either migration issues, or we talk about vacation destinations, or we talk about food, but we don't talk about politics. And I think that that's an important part of the conversation today, in this global community or this global village where we live. After all, we're really not that far from you, right? In many cases, we're only 2 to 3 hours by plane. And I think it is important, and Amber and I actually were just chatting about this very briefly. Sometimes we're a little too US-centric, which there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a beautiful, wide world out there that we definitely want to learn more about. But also because being a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I'm an openly gay man, women have played an important role in my life, particularly in my life experience, being a member of this community, and many of the women in my life being allies. So I'm happy to be an ally back and build them up in whichever way I can. So with that as a bit of a background for our conversation today, let's dive right into our conversation. So Latin America, and when you think about Latin America, is pretty much everything, south of the border from Mexico, all the way to South America, including Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, not including Guyana, French Guyana, and Suriname, which are really not, within the context of Latin America. It does include Brazil, because of the connection with Romance or Latin languages, right? Portuguese and Spanish are related. Dutch and other languages and cultures, as they surface in countries like Suriname and Guyana and French Guyana in the South American continent, do not quite have a similar background as the rest of the countries in the area do. So it's important to understand, and I think that this is a great way to frame today's conversation. Latin America is up against a momentous year on multiple fronts. On the one hand, game-changing national elections in several countries. So if you didn't know, El Salvador, Panama, Dominican Republic already had their elections earlier this year. Mexico just had its elections on June the 2nd, and Uruguay and Venezuela will have their elections. And these are federal nationwide elections for the most part later this year. These countries are poised to reshape the political scenario in the region for a number of different reasons. If we think about El Salvador, the migration issues and criminal gangs issues in El Salvador, Panama has been on the news, quite a bit that last year because of the climate issues that are impacting the Panama Canal. The Dominican Republic has been in the news as a rising economy and a country that probably within the next decade will be a middle income country as defined by some of the larger global organizations like the United Nations. Uruguay and Venezuela, two very different countries, right? Uruguay is a middle income country right there with Chile and a few other countries in Latin America, doing very well, enjoying political stability, unlike many other Latin American countries. And then Venezuela, last but not least, a lot of instability, a lot of issues associated with socio-political, geopolitical issues in Venezuela that have made Venezuela the target of news, particularly the mass migration of Venezuelans from the country to many other countries around the world. We can see that here in Mexico. We can see that in the US, Spain, and a number of other countries around the world. But as a backdrop to all of this, an important feminist movement has been unfolding and continues to unfold on the heels of a year marked by discussions on gender equality, with critical implications in both the political and economic spheres. So how do these two connect? Well, political uncertainties can affect the economy as they tend to curb foreign investments, evaluate local currencies, and increase interest rates. So on the flip side, fostering gender equality supports economic resilience and boosts growth. It is also critical in achieving development outcomes as outlined in Goal 5 of the 2030 Sustainable Development. So what this means, if I were to say this in plainer words, is women rock. Many times they're the head of the household. They will not sit idle, right, at home, just waiting for things to happen to them. They have careers to enhance and develop. They have, in some cases, children to care for. In most Latin American cultures and Latin American countries, there are multiple generations living under the same roof. And the work age, the productive age women in the household, they have no choice but to move on and do what they need to do to take care of the family. So Latin American countries have made great strides toward reducing gender inequalities. And that obviously has been the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about the topic we're talking about today. However, women have, and even though they have gained a greater foothold in the labor market and in access to health, things are just not quite where they need to be. And it is important to understand that they now exceed men in years of schooling. And I think that that's the case in the United States as well. So when it comes to that, basically more women are going to school and getting higher education or more advanced education, even if it is technical education beyond the basic schooling, beyond their high school graduation. And they're also exceeding men in life expectancy rates. And women's political participation has also increased. And that's really at the center of our conversation today, right? But despite these advances, however, a wide gender gap remains. According to the Global Gender Gap Report, the region still needs to close a 29.8% gender gap, which will take another 79 years. So it is important to understand, the figures are a stark reminder that women represent about 50% of the region's population, but account for only 41% of the labor force. This is formal employment, and earn on average 16% less than men. Moreover, occupational segregation remains high, and better education achievement has not led to higher paid jobs for women. Indeed, wage disparity in skilled jobs as high as 25.6%, continue to impede women's economy empowerment. So if we take a look at the slide we have here on the screen, it's important to understand all of this information. And let's refer to it here real quick and take a look at it because I think it is important. So just to provide a little bit better of a background, around the conversation that we're having, we're going to use the Mexico example to let you know a little bit more about the impact of the conversation that we're having today. So as you can see there on the screen, Mexico had a historic election on June 2nd, 2024. We elected our president, for the next 6 years. I say I'm not a citizen yet, but I am a resident of the country. So obviously, the president of the country is my president as well. And I think it is important that we take a look at what happened here, so it can continue, to give us an idea of, what an amazing progress we've made, but how much more we have to go. We'll see that in subsequent sections of our conversation today. So on June 2nd, 98 million Mexicans were registered to vote. So there's a National Elections Institute. You have to register to vote at the age of 18. It's not something that you can postpone or do at a later date. Your electoral or your voter's ID is used for pretty much every single transaction, public, private, in any type of environment or setting. If you don't have your voter's ID, basically, you don't have the ability to complete a transaction. So it's one of the ways that the government makes sure that at the age of 18, you get registered to vote, because it is not only a privilege, it really is a responsibility. Excuse me, and really at the end of the day, is an obligation of every single Mexican citizen. Out of the 98 million people that were registered to vote, 60 million voted. So that means that there was a 61% participation overall. Unfortunately, the U.S. and other more developed, Western countries do not have that level of participation. So kudos to the Mexican people, for achieving that. That definitely puts Mexico in a completely different league when it comes to voters' participation. Throughout the campaign, there were 2 leading female candidates. So that's something that has never happened before in the history of politics in the U.S. We will see here in a moment that there have been quite a few presidential candidates who are female, but there had never really been 2 leading candidates. And at the end of the day, when everything was said and done, the first ever female president in the 203 years of the official name actually is the United States of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, but twice married, the other 2 of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish background, who holds a doctor's degree and the highest voting record of all time. 35 million Mexicans voted for her, was elected president. So that is absolutely outstanding, and definitely something that the US and many other countries really should take note of. If we move on to the next slide, and we talk about the historical context and quota laws, I think it is important that we take a quick look at this, because if anybody knows about quotas, we do, right, as diversity practitioners. And it's been part of the approach to more diversity and inclusion in many workplaces. And the reality is that it's been applied in many of these countries. I'll be going into a little more detail about that in just a moment. But let me just share with you particularly what quota laws have accomplished in many of these countries. In the region, in 1990, women's representation in the lower houses of Congress, like the House of Representatives or Congress, we would call it here as well, was 9% in 2002. And this is the most recent study. Some of the more recent studies in the last 20 years have not been quite released yet. but that went up to 15%. Women's share of the Senate was 5% in 1990. In the 2000s, it reached up to 12%. And ministerial post, meaning in many cases the cabinet and the next level down from the president, that was at about 9% participation by women in 1990. By 2002, that was 13% as an average, but really in some countries it went as high as 25%. So there is value in this quota law. We'll talk about them in just a moment, but let me step back for a minute and share with you a little bit about the historical underrepresentation of women to set the foundation for the remainder of our conversation. As you might imagine, as in the rest of the world, women have historically been severely underrepresented in elective office. That's the case in Latin America and in many other places around the world. Women's presence in political decision making has never been equal to men. Recognizing that this underrepresentation really poses a threat to democracy, political equality, justice, and other negative impacts, more and more people, including some male politicians and opinion leaders, have endorsed measures to increase women participation. And that basically started in the 1990s. We'll see that in just a moment with a list of female presidents that I'm going to be sharing with you here in just a moment. Though the results vary depending on electoral rules and party compliance, they don't always align with the quota requirements. This quota movement marks a watershed in public moment in public attitudes toward women in power and in official commitments to women's equality. So, for example, we talked about where we were in 1990 and where we ended up in 2002. But let's talk a little bit more in detail about these quota laws. So first of all, not all countries have adopted these laws for women. And in some countries where the laws do exist, sometimes they're just weakly implemented or they're simply just not enforced, right? The political parties will kind of forget about them and nobody will really challenge the party. And at the end of the day, we end up with mainly male candidates. Quotas, when they succeed in bringing women into power, do not always grant women the resources they need to use that power effectively. So even if women do win, in some cases, in some countries, those political candidates, elected political candidates, have not been provided with the resources that historically would have been provided to male candidates. So in the 80s and 90s in Latin American countries, we started to see a little bit of that change, very specifically going in the direction of creating a more democratic political environment, and what's happened with some countries where they have started to move more and more into a free market capitalism style socioeconomic environment. With the exception of Cuba, unfortunately, those countries suffering under military dictatorship and authoritarian one-party systems, many of them have made the transition to free elections and competitive party politics, which in turn has opened up, opportunities and possibilities for female candidates. And because they have embraced I would say a less conservative, I'm not sure that I can say a more liberal, but a less conservative perspective, because they're liberalizing trade, privatizing state-owned enterprises, reducing regulations and balancing budgets and paying off debt, so on and so forth. That's put them in a situation where they're seeing their perspective on political, social, and cultural issues has changed a little bit more, which has given women, this unique opportunity to participate. As we move on to the next slide, would like to then share with you a little bit more about that cultural and social context and the challenges associated with them. I'm not going to read the slide itself, but you can see, some of those issues there. It's no secret, right, that many Latin American countries are known for a very strong machista or machismo culture. There are issues with misogyny, patriarchy, and a number of other issues, including religious context, very conservative religious context, that has made it very difficult for women to rise in politics. because even from a religious perspective, in many cases, women are not supposed to have a leadership position in the church. Therefore, in many countries, that translates into them not having leadership opportunities in politics. So, talking about some of these cultural challenges, happy to provide you with a little bit more background because it is incredibly important to understand what women have been up against in many of these countries. Because I am in Mexico, and it is the example that I know the best. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Mexico, but the reality is that in general, this extends to other countries in the region. Mexico is known for a culture where machismo reigns supreme. Misogynistic behaviors, aggressive treatment, and rampant violence against women, many times resulting in murder, called feminicide. I'm not even sure we have that word in English, but it does exist in Spanish, feminicidio. So the very specific um, acts of murder against female humans. Never heard that word before in English. It's very interesting that within this culture, we even have a very specific word to use to describe that kind of violence against women. It's something that unfortunately has been very prevalent. In addition, the discourse about whether women could govern Mexico was not only ever present from the very beginning of the campaign, but it had also never been seriously considered. So it is important to know that there had never really been a viable female candidate in this country ever in its 203 years. We've had in Mexico well over 40 something heads of state, from presidents to emperors, and none of them really were females, with the exception of Empress Charlotte, who was the wife of Emperor Maximilian. So she was not, in her own right, an empress. She was an empress only because she was married to Emperor Maximilian. So women had never really had a particularly important place in Mexican politics before. And it's really interesting because unfortunately, that's a reality in many countries around it. And by comparison, for example, the USA, it's no stranger to that conversation, questioning whether women are capable of political leadership or not. And we know, right, in 2016, that was an issue that was presented to us during the presidential elections when Hillary Clinton was a candidate. And lastly, with the poor record of female presidents all over the world, but particularly in Latin America, we really never imagined that we'd be seeing a day like this. So when we talk about women in power, the question is then within this cultural and social context and all of these cultural challenges, and not all of them are listed here. I'm sure you have, other examples. I'd like you to take a moment and start thinking about that and thinking about what other cultural challenges are you aware of in the region. Then the question is, can women really make a difference? So even if quota, social changes, and shifting cultural attitudes that are combined to expand women's opportunities to gain power, the question really remains on whether women's greater presence makes a difference for policy outcomes. And this is where we start talking about impact a little more specifically, right? So I'm not necessarily going to give you an impact of, a list of the 5 impacts, but throughout the conversation, we're going to talk about a few things. And this is one of those first impacts that we're going to be talking about. Are women's legislative and policy priorities better served by having more women in power, or can male politicians just as effectively represent women's needs in the political process? It's important to keep in mind that not all arguments in favor of women's representation focus on consequences or policy outcomes, right? Some people argue that women's presence in power is a simple question of fairness, right? Just equality. The systematic discrepancy between women's participation at the middle and bottom of the organizations and their presence in decision making is clear evidence of an injustice. It's argued, right? Fairness demands that women get their proper share of power, regardless of whether they use this power to promote women's interests. And I think that this is a very important argument because basically what we're trying to say here is that women in elected positions, women in politics have this unique opportunity to advance women's issues, but they also have to be careful, right, about not focusing so much on the female population that then they completely disregard the broader needs of the communities that they're representing and they're supposed to be serving. So I think that's where, unfortunately, but it's a reality, women are held to a completely different standard. Well, I don't recall really anybody having too much of a serious conversation talking about legislators that are legislating for men. The reality is that it's sort of a given, you know, and there's really not a whole lot of questioning in general about whether they're legislating positively in favor of the female population. So what I would like to do next is I'd like to kind of pause because I've been talking a lot and I want to keep you awake and engaged. So I would like to give you some very specific examples or a list of notable female presidents. So we'll move on to the next slide and we'll start with Isabel Perón, not to be confused with Evita Perón, right? Evita is a whole other conversation. She's not part of the conversation today. She's much more than Madonna's musical or the Broadway musical, but we're not talking about Evita Perón today. We're talking about Isabel Perón. She was the president of Argentina between 1974 and 1976. Really a pioneer and the example that most other presidents followed. If we move on to the next slide, you will learn about Lidia Gayler Tejada. I don't know, Amber, if we move down to the next slide. I can't see it on my, okay, perfect. And she was the interim president of Bolivia. So while not elected, she was given the responsibility to lead Bolivia between 1979 and 1980. Then we have, moving on to the next slide, Violeta Chamorro. She was president of Nicaragua, and she was in office between 1990 and 1997. So I would like you to just take a moment here and think about what I shared with you earlier, and the fact that this movement, particularly with the quota laws that were enacted in some countries, started to help see this shift. So Isabel Perón was elected in the 70s. There was really no movement, basically, for 2 decades. This other president, really an interim president, she was selected, not elected, Lidia Gayler in Bolivia. So we jump onto the 1990s and beyond, and then we see, we start seeing this shift of the next 10 female presidents in Latin America. So moving on to the next slide, I would like to introduce you to Rosalia Arteaga, also interim president of Ecuador in 1997. She was in office for 1 year only. If we move on to the next slide, Mireya Moscoso was president of Panama between 1999 and 2004. Probably when I started to become more aware of these political issues, I got to learn about, on the next slide, Michelle Bachelet, and she was president of Chile 2006, between 2006 and 2010. I think that the advent of the internet for all and the beginning of some of these social platforms gave us the opportunity to learn about these female presidents. And in my memory, this is the first president female president that I ever heard of, nearly 20 years ago. A very well-known and much controversial president, if we move on to the next slide, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. Her husband had been president of Argentina as well. So she took the reins of the country between 2007 and 2015, nearly 10 years. Moving on to the next slide, Laura Chinchilla became the president of Costa Rica. Not surprised that she became president of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is one of the few countries that have enjoyed the most stable social, economic, and political environment in the history of the region. And she was president for 1 term between 2010 and 2014. We move on to the next slide and allow me to introduce you to Dilma Rousseff. Very, very well-known Brazilian president. She was president between 2010 and 2016. She was accused by her successor, President Bolsonaro, of corruption. She was tried. She was jailed. She was eventually in prison. She spent quite some time there. And then, it turned out that Bolsonaro was the the I guess that the corrupt one in all of the situation. Bolsonaro now is facing jail time as well, and Lima has been vindicated and now has been free for quite some time and back in the political arena. Moving on to the next item, I'm sorry, the next president, Janine Áñez of Bolivia between 2019 and 2020. Next, Dina Boluarte, president of Peru from 2022 to the president, and Claudia Sheinbaum, now the president of Mexico, just elected in June. Okay. So my apologies. It seems like they're doing a little bit of construction here just outside of my office. I was not aware of that. Amber, the background noise is manageable? Or...
I'm really not hearing it.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to make a commercial for these earphones because it's so loud here. I was afraid that you were not going to be able to hear me. So perfect. Let's move on. Let's pretend that there is no background noise. All right. So moving to the next slide. On this slide, we're sharing with you a little bit of this information. Conversation prior to presenting the female presidents to all of you. I wanted to break up, the conversation a little bit. These conversations sometimes can feel more of a lecture than a conversation. So I just wanted to give you some very specific examples of these leaders and what they did, and hopefully we'll be able to inform you and the conversations that you definitely want to have with your teams, maybe your employee resource groups, with your women's network, with your Hispanic or Latin employee resource groups. I think that this is a great conversation to have because, again, we don't always take the time to have conversations about women in politics in Latin America. So happy to share this information with you. All right. So let's talk about policy outcomes. We started talking about a little bit of that before I paused and shared with you this list of female presidents. But it's important to understand that the greater presence of women in national legislatures coincided with unprecedented attention to women's rights, like domestic violence, reproduction rights, family law, and other important issues. Women from different political parties formed alliances to put women's issues in the policy agenda, and then to pressure their male colleagues because they were not in those positions of power to support changes in the law. In the 1990s, again, it seems like there was a big shift in the 1990s. At least 16 Latin American countries approved legislation to help victims of domestic violence. Laws that passed that had never been seen before, never even considered. So that was a great advancement for the female population. Several communities also launched programs to improve women's reproductive health, including cervical cancer screening programs, family planning, and AIDS prevention. A few countries reformed their constitutions to endorse principles of equal rights between men and women, and several more modified family law provisions that had granted husbands and fathers unequal authority in the household. For example, not only women couldn't vote, they couldn't have their own bank accounts. They couldn't get involved in any kind of transactions involving real estate. In fact, properties could not be in the name of women. There were a number of other issues that were making it very, very difficult for women to really be able to stand on their own, even though they had the capacity, they had the capability to do so. They didn't have the backing, with assets, right? They didn't have the ability to drive. They didn't have the ability to be as independent as they needed to be able to execute on that knowledge and education that they had received, and really put forth on the forefront, some of those issues that were important to them. Again, talking about Mexico in 2000, in the year 2000, Rosario Robles, who was then the mayor of Mexico City, he broke the Latin American abortion stalemate by introducing legislation to modify the city's criminal code on abortion matters. The proposal was approved by a number of different parties. Mexico had been ruled mainly by conservative parties up until really just 2 elections ago. And these parties agreed to women's reproductive rights. And they legalized abortions performed if the mother's health, not just her life, was at risk, or if the fetus had birth defects. So all of this happened really within just the last few decades. Robles accepted the long-standing feminist argument that abortion is a public health problem, since resorting to clandestine abortions poses great risk for women's lives and health. No other Latin American country has liberalized its abortion laws since the 1940s, until Mexico did a few years, even expanded a few years ago. And I think it is important to talk about that if we move on to the next slide. Oh, I think that you're already there. Yeah, no, let's move on to the next slide, Amber, please. Perfect. So we'll be talking about that in just a moment. So in general, Latin American women have disagreed seriously about the issue of abortion. So I think that it's important we talk about both sides of the coin. It's been much easier for women to form political alliances around issues like domestic violence and sexual harassment, rape, quotas, and then that it's been around reproductive rights, specifically the issue of abortion. So sometimes women have had to agree in advance to keep abortion off the agenda, and women's alliances really, at the end of the day, for political purposes, they need to be shaped, by the political platform or the agenda of a specific political party. So there will always be conflicts around that. Not to mention, I think that I mentioned this very briefly earlier in our conversation. Party loyalties conflict with the promotion of gender issues, and that's a reality in pretty much every country, and the formation of alliances with other women. There is evidence, right, that the promotion of individual women leaders in other parties through events and mechanisms designed for women's advancement as a whole, it's the way that now many political parties are going. So it is important to keep in mind that the female population, and particularly women in politics, this is not a monolith. Not all women think alike. They obviously come from all kinds of different backgrounds. And of course, at the end of the day, social attitude, cultural environments or frameworks, and religion play a huge part in making sure that women really can advance or not their specific, female issues for the female population in their countries. That has been changing, and that's good news. It's changed in Mexico, and we hope that it continues to change in other countries. So it is important to understand that while women as a whole, as 51% of the population in many cases, continue to work together to ensure that their issues are advanced, that their rights are advanced, and that they're doing that in many different fronts. Civil society, nonprofit organizations, community organization, all of that, very specifically in the political movement in their countries. The reality is that not all women are liberal women, and not all women are conservative, right? So it is important that gender doesn't define perspectives. So we cannot think that all women, are getting into politics to advance. The liberalism or to advance democracy. In fact, we're seeing that in Europe these days, right? For the last year, maybe 2 years, there's been a rise in female political leaders that are more fundamentalist, that are more conservative, that are really trying to push sort of a religious agenda in their countries. And when we think about countries that have been in the news for quite some time now, when we talk about this issue, we can think about Italy, we can think about France, and there's been a strong movement in Spain as well. And in a few other countries, the truth is that even Europe struggles with some of these female representation issues. I don't know if any of you knew this, but not all women have the right to vote in all the cantons or maybe counties or regions. That was very recent in this one particular county or region of Switzerland. So, it's important that we have these conversations because sometimes we make the assumptions, right? One assumption, oh, Europe is much more advanced and they're doing things differently. Well, not always, right? So it is important that we inform ourselves on some of these issues. Just as an example, right? Well, no, that's not always the case. And it is important to take into consideration, religious, cultural, and social backgrounds. And that's why a lot of women are doing the work that they're doing through politics. There are plenty of examples. I think that, in the name of time, we're not going to go into all of them. But Peru, is an example of how a conservative, basically fraudulent elections precedent, like Alberto Fujimori in May of 2000, try to get away with, doing some of the things that he was eventually charged for. And he installed 4 women in leadership positions in the National Congress, who essentially were defenders of this fraudulent regime. So, unfortunately, we don't know the circumstances, but at least in appearance, right? In some cases, women's political behavior may have conformed to corruption and to serving the male client, right? And other patterns that are typically not associated with women, but they have been present in Latin America. So it's not been easy. Even when women have gained ground in the political arena in Latin America, in many cases, then they're faced with having to make some of these decisions and to legislate and to rule and lead with a very heavy load on their shoulders of the cultural nuances and the religious influence and the social norms, right? They have been prevalent in these countries. So even if the game ground, as I mentioned, it has not been easy. One thing is to get to a position of political power. A completely different thing is to be able to do, what you need to do, what's right for the country in addressing all the issues, not only the issues of the female population. And just to close up this section before we move on and start to land, some of these conversations, in terms of quota laws or affirmative action, as we would know it in the U.S., 16 of the 18 Latin American countries have implemented affirmative action mechanisms when it comes to women's participation in politics. 5 countries in particular: Bolivia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Nicaragua, they have approved gender parity when it comes to presenting candidates and supporting political candidates. But in spite of the significant regulatory process, there are still large gender-based inequities in the political sphere. So even though in 2017, for example, now I'm bringing it a little bit closer to our time, away from that 2002 timeline that I shared with you earlier, on average, 20.1% of the members of parliament in the region are women. ranking the region second in the world. So Europe has more participation. It has not yet been possible to go beyond 30%. So take it into consideration, and this is where I'd like you to pause for just a moment and understand how important it is to have this conversation, um, not only for Latin America, but for all over the world. And particularly as I know that the vast majority of us, or the vast majority of you, I'm based in Mexico City, but the vast majority of you are based in the US, it is important to think about this, because if you think about the fact that the female population is at least half of the population, to have 30% uh, female representation in politics, particularly in legislatures in this region in particular. It's a goal we're aiming so low, right? Because it doesn't sound like there's a lot of equality, equity, and parity there, but unfortunately, it's as much or as far as we've been able to get to. And in fact, we're at 28%. We're not even at that 30%. So this implies that large differences in terms of parliamentary representation or legislative representation in the lower or single chamber among the different countries of the region, it's nowhere near where it needs to be. It's close, but is nowhere near where it needs to be. So there are gender gaps within political parties and legislative bodies. We know that, again, some of these countries like Bolivia, Mexico, Ecuador, Nicaragua, they have approved parity and alternation on the electoral list. But women continue to be underrepresented. In some cases, as I mentioned, this 28% of overall in politics. In some cases, it's only 20% women in Congress or legislatures around these countries. And what's really important to understand here is that it's not only an issue of not having candidates, not intentionally having female candidates, but not even having a pipeline, right? And as many of us deal with human resources issues, with people issues, we all know how important it is to create those pipelines. So, because political candidates are just not going to show up out of the blue, right? Female political leaders are not going to show up. They need to be nurtured, they need to be mentored, and we need to make sure that in a very intentional way, those pathways are open for them. So this is where I would like to invite, our participants today, all of you, to think about, as you either individually or as representatives of your own practices or your company, think about the importance of getting involved with politics, which we know we typically do not talk about politics in the workplace, but we know that companies have political action committees and they support the campaigns of political candidates, that we question, whether our companies are supporting the pipelines and organizations that promote and create and build up the pipelines of female political candidates. And why this is important? Well, because again, this progress that we've made in Latin America, or if you're based in the US or whatever you may be, is not going to happen. It's not going to be sustainable if we are not creating spaces for decision makers who are friendly. So, moving on to the next slide, what I'd like to do then is to talk about, Amber, you are reading my mind. We're already there, so thank you very much. I'd like to talk about a very specific example. In Bolivia, there was a movement called Parent Now, where there was a very specific, very specific focus on making sure that, this female representation was going in the right direction. So in the case of Bolivia, in the name of time, I'm not going to go into all of the details of what happened. But as you can imagine, first of all, there was a very intentional effort to do this, to promote gender equality in politics. There was a lot of politicking, if you want to put it that way, happening behind the scenes. And then, of course, there were some collaborations. And I think that this is an important part of our conversation as well, because these things happen without some external peer pressure, good peer pressure, if you want to put it that way. So there was a lot of work with international IDEA and the Inter-American Commission of Women in the Organization of American States. And in the case of Bolivia, they systematized, and that was also the case in Ecuador and Costa Rica, but Bolivia was the first one. And they systematized this process of making sure that there was an entire ecosystem built around making sure that women were intentionally involved in the political process. The results were very successful, that we can report very happily, achieving a female representation of 53% in the Chamber of Representatives and 46% in the Senate. So the campaign was good. It wasn't enough, but it was definitely good. And it went right into the objective of promoting a more equity-based process for women to get involved, more equity-based democracy, and really making sure that at the highest levels of politics, women were not only represented, but also supported, to do what they needed to do to serve their communities properly. So with that, I think that we're almost there at the end of our conversation today. I think that progress has been really good. I'm going to start summarizing a few things here. What progress has looked like over the last basically 30, 40 years. Well, I talked about the Parity Now project in Bolivia and in a couple of other countries. Talked about the fact that there is much higher representation in high-ranking political positions in the region. There's been a very public recognition of female power, authority, and ability to mobilize people, which I think is another important thing. Women can make people do things. And a lot of these political parties have relied on women to mobilize people to go vote, to support the political party, to make things happen. Unprecedented healthcare policies, right? We talked a lot about that and some very specific cases. More importantly, safety and security measures were because of the culture. Unfortunately, women were not living in safety. That has changed dramatically in many countries in the region. There's a lot to be done, but it's definitely made a lot of progress in that area. And another important part of this progress has been the fact that there has been a little bit of a back and forth of influence between positions of authority in business and politics. And I think it is important to understand this, although I'm not focused on women in business leadership. Some of this sort of spillover effect of this have gotten into the business world, where because women have been recognized in the political world, then business people, particularly businessmen, have been more open to supporting and opening up, the spaces necessary for women to take over, the reins at a number of different companies. Mexico has a few very large multinational companies based here in Mexico that are led by women. At some point, it would be interesting to talk about that, as most of us really deal with workplace issues and deal with companies. But that's been the case. That there's been a little bit of influence because of what's been happening in politics, and in other cases associated with that, there's been a little bit of pushback on the religious influence in women's rights, right? Where women are no longer silenced, where women can participate fully. And while they may still not be able to participate fully in religious context, they are pushing back on that as well. But in the meantime, they're just participating fully in all other aspects of society. As we move on to the next slide and get a little bit closer to the end of our conversation. Amber, I can't see it on my screen, but maybe you have. Ready?
So this is the last slide. It has your advisory services.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's stay then on the previous one. We'll talk about this for just a few seconds. So if we could go back to the previous one. So I don't know, Amber, if we have the ability to hear from the audience.
Your sound, your sound is going out.
Oh, it was so good until now.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, perfect, perfect. I don't know if some of the participants have any ideas or any comments on what has been the impact beyond what I just shared with you, right? The progress and the outlook. Drop it in the comments if you have the ability to do that. I don't know that you have the ability to actually participate via your microphone, but I think that the conclusion in all of this is that progress has been made. A lot more progress needs to be made. Future actions to further advance women's political participation and equality cannot stop here. And fortunately, there are a number of organizations that will be taking us, to the next 1990s, right? That breakthrough year when female representation in politics changed dramatically. So, what I would like to invite the audience to do is to really take a look at this information and make sure that you have an opportunity to process it. And if you want to reach out to me, there's my contact information. I think that's where we can move on to the next and final slide. um, I've been having the opportunity to work with the Society for Diversity now under the new name. If I'm remembering correctly, we've made a recent change to rename the entire organization the Institute for Diversity Certification. I've had an opportunity to do this webinar before to prepare participants for their certification process, to speak at the conferences. So glad to continue to collaborate with this great organization and to give you an opportunity to continue to learn some of these issues directly from me, and really give you the information that you need and the support that you need, particularly for those organizations that have international or global operations. With that, my time is up, and this is where I officially end my participation and contribution today. Back to you, Amber. Any questions, any comments, anything else?